Welcome back to the Habit-Based Lifestyle Podcast. I'm your host, Jesse Ewell, and today we're going to be talking about the habit of power. But before we go into that, I have a very special guest, Jaque Devore, the owner of Sirens and Titans in Westwood, Los Angeles. He is a strength and conditioning coach for the last 18 years who specializes in maximal sustainable power for athletes, not only athletes, but also adults. And then he's also the author of the book, Bicycling, Maximum Overload for Cyclists. And he's also a good friend of mine that I have met at the biohacking conference about 2 months ago. And we kind of hit it off. And I wanted to invite him on this podcast because he changed the way that I thought about power just in about an hour's worth of time. And so welcome to the show, man.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks for having me. I'm glad we're getting time to spend talking about power.
Yeah. So what is this thing that we are talking about today? Power, like as it translate to fitness and this type of working out.
Yeah. Well, power is often understood. I mean, the physics of power is force times distance divided by time. It's physics. Strength is your ability to generate a force, and it's easily measurable. You just add 5 more pounds to the bar, and you're 5 pounds stronger. You add 10 more pounds. So it's always been easy to measure strength. I have a 500-pound deadlift, or I have a 200-pound deadlift. That's easy. Power is much more difficult because power is strength with velocity. So it's force and velocity. And the problem is velocity is harder to measure. So a power clean, if I was to look at it and I was to have you do a power clean or any kind of a vertical jump, I would say, is that your maximum power output? Now we could measure it. A vertical jump is a good measurement of power, a broad jump, so how far you can jump. And in the combine for football players and everything else, they have a lot of power measurements with short bursts of power because that's what that sport requires. But power is getting easier to measure because technology is coming in, and there's velocity-based programs where they have an accelerometer built into a little band on a bar, and they can start measuring it a lot easier. But it's always been difficult, and it's really been eyeballed by the coach. So if I have you doing a Olympic snatch or a power clean, I have to determine at what weight on the bar are you producing the most amount of power. And the easiest way to understand it is strength is your ability to generate a force. So if I was pushing against a wall as hard as I could, and there's a force plate against the wall measuring how hard I'm pushing, that's how strong I am. A guy that's you're bigger than me, you'll push harder. A guy that's twice your size will push harder. But then if I move the wall away as you're pushing, then there's a velocity component. And the higher the speed that the wall moves away from you, the greater amount of power that's being produced to a point. If the wall was too light and I pushed at a rapid rate of speed, I wouldn't be at optimum power. So power is a combination of both force production and velocity combined. And I tell people I can take a bullet and I can throw it at you. It's harmless. But if I add a huge amount of velocity to it, it's lethal.
Right.
And in sport, power is everything. Power is how you jump laterally, forward, backward. Power is how you move an opponent in wrestling. Power is how you throw somebody in a judo match, in a 100-meter dash. Power is really shown because it's how someone moves their body through space in a very short amount of time. But there's also power, and when you talked earlier about maximum sustainable power, any event that lasts longer than about 20 seconds in length in sport requires a sustainability of power. And I'll give you an example. Your best 100-meter dash runner is not always your best 200-meter runner. Now, the reason why is because he has to hold or she has to hold the highest percentage of their 100-meter speed longer throughout the entire time. So there's this continuum of really, really explosive absolute power, which is typically a much bigger athlete, all the way to, if you were to look at runners as an example, a 100-meter dash runner, if you look at the start of a 100-meter dash in the Olympics, These guys are muscular. They got
Right.
big bodies. They got big, huge legs because they're producing power for about 10 seconds, and that's it. So it's how fast can they come out of the blocks. And then if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you look at a marathoner, world class, these guys have to keep an average level of power throughout 26 miles. So if you were to create a race, a series of races of the 100-meter dash runner against the marathoner, in the 100-meter, the 100-meter guy would win every single one. But then if you go to 200 meters, maybe the marathon runner is closer, but still not winning. Then if you go to 500 meters, 800 meters, 1,500 meters, probably there's a tipping point where you see at 1,000 meters or 1,200 meters, the marathoner starts to pull away from the 100-meter dash. That's where his production of average power starts to win the game because the duration of time is going out longer. So he can produce power more efficiently. So when I say sustainable power, it's really the efficiency of production of power. You're using less energy to produce power for longer periods of time. And if I ask any athlete that I have, a tennis player, a basketball player, a volleyball player, which a lot of people would say are absolute power sports, if I ask them, a volleyball player, if I said, if you could jump as well in the end of the game as you do at the beginning of the game, how much more would you win? And they go, oh my gosh, a huge amount more. So that's efficiency of power. So that early in the game, they're using less energy to produce the same jump. And then at the end of the game, they're out jumping their opponents and beating them to the ball and winning. And so when I look at power and how it's trained today, most of the strength coaches are focused on absolute power. How do I increase your vertical jump for one jump? Can I add 3 or 4 inches to your vertical jump? And then they let the efficiency of power take care of itself through conditioning in the sport. I turned it on its head and I said, why don't I look at how to put training programs together that allow you to produce power over longer periods of time at close to maximum as possible, because you would win a lot more. So it makes sense if you think about training athletes that way. So I've spent a lot of time on figuring out ways to improve the efficiency of production of power for athletes in sports that are lasting longer than just 20 seconds.
Okay, so let me just kind of slow this down for a second. So
Sure.
absolute power is something you may do for, one time up to 20 seconds.
I'd say, 10 seconds. I would actually say
10 seconds. And then anything above that turns into what you call now sustainable power.
Correct.
And your whole approach to this sustainable power is to say, hey, if you're a, football player, if you're a basketball player, if you're a volleyball player, we want you to jump the exact same at the beginning of the game, at the end of the game. And that's really what sustainable power is, or the beginning of the rep or workout as the end of the workout. And someone who's absolute is just this 10 seconds and that's it, they're done.
100%. That's correct. That's a good explanation of it. So, for example, and it's position specific too. So I trained Cassius Marsh at one point in time when he was playing. He's back with the Seahawks again, but he's a defensive end. So he has to hit and then repeat, and then hit and repeat, and hit and repeat. And if at the end of the game he can continue to produce that explosive power off the line, beat the opposing player to the punch, then he'll have a lot better game and a greater opportunity to make sacks and perform and make tackles than if his power is diminishing dramatically, or his power is diminishing at a greater rate than his opponent, because then his opponent can stop him from making the tackle. So
Sure.
Yeah, exactly right.
And, one of the things that I've seen is a lot of strength coaches or a lot of guys that are training, they're stuck in this mindset of absolute power, and I don't see a lot of them, even talking or training this, this other power that you're talking about, which is, this is what kind of, like when I first heard it, this sustainable power, I was like, man, like where was this when I was in, training for football and stuff like that. But can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, what I had done is I had read a research paper from these two Stanford professors. And these Stanford professors came up with this, they were exercise physiology professors. They came up with this cooling glove it's called now Cool Control. And they found that if they cooled the hand of a power lifter in between sets, that they got more overloads or bigger lifts longer throughout their workouts. And so the way you get an athlete to improve as a strength coach is you design a program to get bigger and bigger loads. It's called, a progressive resistance. So you're increasing the progression, you're progressively increasing the amount of overload in an athlete to keep improving them. And people think of that, if I lift 5 pounds the first time and then I lift 10 pounds and then I lift 15 pounds. So my job as a strength coach is to come up with a design to maximize that. So I was reading this article about that, and they said, wow, if we cooled the hands, we were able to get bigger PRs and more PRs in each workout, which means that they progressed at a greater rate because they were getting heavier lifts earlier in workouts more often. And typically the difference between a really young athlete and an older athlete is the ability to recover from efforts. Right. So they found recovery was improved. So I turned it on its head and I said, wow, what would happen if you didn't heat up the muscle that much? Because what they found is that the muscle would heat up, and that would slow the ability to get bigger loads on the bar when they were lifting, because that's how your body works. It's a defense mechanism so you don't hurt yourself. So I started playing with this with power on an isokinetic machine, which measures power output in a jump. And I said, what if instead of doing the traditional method of training power, which is typically 6 or 8 reps of a power clean, you get a full recovery, you do another set, you get a full recovery, maybe you do 2 or 3 sets, and that's your power output for the day, and then you'll do some endurance, some strength endurance or power endurance work at a much lower energy output. I said, what happens if I took the same amount, if I was to ask you, okay, so you can power clean 185 pounds, and you can do that 6 times, and that's pretty rough. And you say, okay, great. So we do it 6 times. Instead of doing it 3 sets in a row, what if I did 3 reps, rest for 10 seconds, 3 reps, rest for 10 seconds, 3 reps, rest for 10 seconds. So I don't let the muscle heat up that much by doing all 6 or 8 reps in a row. I found that I could get much greater overloads in power for you. So instead of just doing the 18 reps, the 6 reps every set for 3, I did it on an isokinetic equipment. All of a sudden, I was getting minutes of time at this high level of output. Now, on the strength side of the equation, they do this. They call this a cluster set. So a lot of bodybuilders and strength people will do cluster sets where they'll take a weight and they'll do the same weight at a lower number of total reps, rest in between, and continue to do that. So they'll do that that way. But I'm doing it with power. And what it's allowing me to do is get big monster overloads. And then the body adapts by getting more efficient at producing power for long periods of time. So that's the way I'm doing that.
And really what the body's doing is getting more efficient at recovery, which in turn is giving you that sustainable power.
Yeah, because it's forcing your body to spend more time at that maximum power output. What was happening before, the traditional way of doing it is you spend very little time at maximum. This way I can spend a much greater amount of time at maximum overloads. That's why I call it maximum sustainable power, because I'm trying to stay as close to your maximum power as I possibly can. And I use a lot of isoinertial. There's a piece of equipment called a VersaPulley. There's another piece of equipment called the K-Box you may have seen. These are isoinertial. They work on a flywheel system, and it measures the power output. So in any rate, if I have a tennis player, I can do a side chop for maximum sustainable power. I can do a lot of hip movements for people who are hip dominant athletes. So that's the basis of where this came from. So I just started experimenting on myself initially because I was competitively racing bikes at the time. And I said, as I got older, it was becoming more difficult for me to get overloads. And I was going, well, I just don't recover as fast. It's hard for me to get overloads. and power is always a problem because landing and jumping and doing it's very ballistic. And as we get older, those ballistic types of exercises are very difficult to handle. So I started coming up with ways to do it longer, and it just improved my performance dramatically. So it really works well for the aging athlete as well.
So let's just talk about the adult, whether you're an athlete or, in the terms what I used to call is like general population.
Sure.
Like, what is the big problem with the general population and this link of power associated with it?
Yeah, well, the biggest problem with producing power is it's hard. It's taxing. I mean, you've done power cleans. If you just stand, anyone that's listening to this, stand in your office and jump 8 times in a row and watch what happens to your heart rate. Just stand there and just jump and try to touch the ceiling 6, 8, 10 times in a row. It's taxing. It's not fun. It's hard. So that's the problem. That's the first problem is it's difficult. So it needs to be designed well. So it has to be designed in a way that the individual can handle it. So that's number one. Number two is it's hard to determine what to do. If you go to a CrossFit gym and you're 40 years old and they're saying, look, we're going to put you on a bunch of snatches and we're going to teach you how to do power cleans and the oxymoron, and I love CrossFit because they brought the barbell back into the gym, but power at maximum, if you just keep doing it, eventually the body gets fatigued and then the joint has to take the load and then the potential for injury goes up dramatically. All of my coaches here, I tell them, I said, once someone gets over 35 years old, you have to be very sensitive to all kinds of, when you start adding volume to power, because when you add power and volume together, it can become very dangerous because the fatigue hits really quickly. Just like I said, if you jump 6 times in a row, 8 times in a row, just try to keep doing that as many reps as possible, which is a workout, AMRAP. We hear it all the time. Let's get as many reps as possible doing burpees or jumping. It becomes dangerous after about probably 10 or 12 reps. And that's one of the biggest issues with power is because a lot of people get hurt executing it. Doing it this way, you're limiting the amount of reps. So you're doing maybe 3 reps clean at close to maximum, and then you're resting for 10 or 15 seconds, and then 3 reps again, clean, resting. So the rest in between the reps allows the body to recover, and the primary fuel substrate is ATP. It's the primary fuel for muscle firing. And as you get longer in the duration of an exercise that's power-based, ATP drops off fast. That's why you can't keep producing the same amount of muscle contraction. So by adding in that small rest in between, it lowers the risk for injury dramatically and increases the ability to produce power over longer periods of time. So it's a very safe way to do it for someone who's older.
So, like we take adults, kind of the model of CrossFit is, hey, you're going to do box jumps, bringing your knees up to your chest. You're going to do a bunch of cleans, which, neither one of those are really training for power. They're training, for whatever. They're training for, like, to me, I look at CrossFit as a sport. It has a function of power and strength. But when I look at the average adult, why is it important that the average adult trains power? And sometimes I like to think for adults as power as like this reactive training, this fall prevention, because it's a training that they don't get, and it's also something that they lose at a higher rate than they lose strength.
Right, and the main reason why is an easy way to see it is you don't see many 35-year-old, it's very rare, 100-meter dash runners at an Olympic level.
Right.
Because what happens is at about 24, 25 years old, fast twitch muscle fiber starts to diminish in your body. So your ability to have a high-speed contraction and produce that much power starts to diminish at a very young age. So think how much, they say you lose about 10% of it a year for every year over 25 years old. So by the
Wow.
time you're 35 years old, you've lost a lot of fast twitch muscle contraction capability, and you can't produce the same amount of power that you were. The other problem is it's ballistic. And so tendons, joints, these kinds of things are not as pliable as they were when we were young and we could jump off the roof of a house and not hurt ourselves. I remember when I was a kid, I would jump off the roof of the house and land in the front yard. My brother and I did. We thought it was really cool. If I did that now, I'd be hospitalized. I would be in the hospital for weeks. So you can't do that kind of stuff because your body won't take it. So power is that type of jumping off the roof and landing. And if you add volume to it, that's when it becomes a problem. So CrossFit, you're right. It's really a muscle endurance and strength endurance exercise. The way I would design a CrossFit workout is I would have someone jumping up to the box, stepping down, jumping up to the box, and I would have them jump up 3 times, step down, rest for 15 seconds, jump up 3 times, step down, rest for 15 seconds. And then what happens is they're getting maximum power based on the height of that box, but they're doing it in a very safe fashion that allows them to better monitor fatigue and get maximum output. So you're getting a more greater amount of high-speed muscle contraction to get that height of the box.
And you're not putting a bunch of stress on your joints.
Right, and then you're not going from the plyo box jump to the power clean. Because once you have no break and you go right from the plyo box to the power clean is going to be diminished. The integrity of that lift is going to be a lot harder to execute because the lower body is so fatigued from the jumps at that point in time.
And you're no longer training power, you're now training muscular endurance.
And you're trying to do a power exercise in an endurance format, and that's an oxymoron. You shouldn't be doing that. That's the problem.
Yeah, so one of the things that when I owned the gym that I had, we did a lot of reactive training with clients because this was something, and we would call it power, but we would also call it reactive training because someone at, 60, 65, they just couldn't do the load of even jumping. So sometimes, just giving them some type of reactive training. Like, what is your thoughts around this for people, maybe over like 50, 55, 60 who may have joint pain and can't do this stuff?
Well, you can, but you have to modify things. So, for example, I could do a power exercise with a plyo box, a small to medium-sized step-up. So what you do is you start on the top of the box, step down, and then explode back up. There's no impact now. The foot stays planted on the box. So there's not as much of the ballistic impact, but you're still getting the high-speed contraction because you're trying to step with speed. So there have to be some modifications. You can do it with an explosive ball toss for distance. So it would lower the risk of injury because someone could do a squatted chest ball toss, but you have to measure the output. So that's where the wheels come off. Like when I do a rotational ball toss against the wall, we have markers on the wall. So I know, and I keep stepping the client back from the wall. And if the power is diminishing, the ball will fall below the marker eventually. It's like a bullet traveling for miles, and eventually the velocity diminishes and it drops into the dirt. It's the same thing with a wall toss. So I'm doing what I call the poor man's power meter. I'm measuring the power output. And if the power starts to diminish below what I think should be their maximum, then we stop the exercise and rest and then start it over again. So you can do it, but you have to modify it. There's no doubt about it. Even now, we use a lot of the isoinertial equipment because there is no impact, but you can do it with plyo boxes. You can do it with jumping up and landing, as opposed to doing a depth jump where you jump off a small box, land, and then jump up to a bigger box, which is going to be more ballistic. You just have to make some adjustments. Like on a explosive, you would do a clapping push-up from the floor. I may have my clients do the clapping push-up from a bench. So the angle is different and it unloads the upper body a lot more. So we're going to make those adjustments, and there may be no clap. It may just be an acceleration so their hands are coming off the bench. So you're going to make those adjustments, but still it would be set up as a power exercise, just like I would with a world-class athlete. Just the level of intensity will diminish. but we want that high-speed muscle contraction. That's what we're shooting for.
Which, by the way, since a couple months ago, the Biohacking Conference, I've been doing this in my workouts in the beginning for about 15 minutes total, but I've been doing I think you were doing like 3 to 4 reps inside of like 10 seconds, and then 15 to 20 seconds rest, and then hitting it again. I've been doing this a ton, and actually one of my training partners he's a Ironman. He's been doing it with me, and we've both been really noticing a lot of change. One of the things that I've noticed is I haven't had to train as long and as much in strength because of it, and that's been one of the really cool things I've noticed. Plus, my joints aren't taking on the load that they were trying to get that stuff in.
Yeah, the great thing about it is, I've talked to you in the past about microdosing exercise, small little doses on a regular basis. And this doesn't take that long a time. I can do a maximum, what I call an MSP workout is how I title them here in the gym, an MSP workout for hips. And I can do it in 4 minutes. I mean, literally a warm up, and then we're doing 4 pulls on a VersaPulley every 10 seconds for 4 minutes, and it's a killer. If you do 4 minutes of this, you are toast. And if you can do 2 sets of 4 minutes, you are completely knackered. But the value of it is so great. And you will see improvements in strength and everything else, because it improves that ability to be more efficient at tapping into fast twitch muscle fiber, which helps your strength side of the equation. So all of a sudden, coming out of the hole on a deadlift, you're going to go, wow, I felt really, really good coming out of the hole on that. Or the initial pull on a power clean, you're going to go, God, that felt great. By that 6th rep, you're feeling really good. So that's what starts to change, because it's not that you're pulling any harder, but you're more efficient. So you're using less energy in the early pulls. So in the early, if you're doing plyo jumps, it feels easier, but what's really happening is you're working less. You're jumping the same height. You're still on the same box, but you just feel better.
Yeah.
So it's fantastic.
So let's talk about not training in power. Like if you're say, I'm not going to say athlete, because all athletes, I think at some level are training some type of power, whether it's absolute or sustainable, they're still training it. But as an adult, what happens when you don't train in power for years?
Yeah, well, I'll give you an example. You know better. You owned a gym, and you got what I call the 45-year-old gym rat. The guy goes into the gym, does his bench, does some curls, gets on the leg press because that's easy. He doesn't want to do squats, doesn't want to do deadlifts, so he gets on a leg press machine, does some leg presses, does some crunches, and does some overhead, shoulder work or something that he likes. It's all good, nothing wrong with it. He looks good in a suit, but the minute he has to move, and power is all about a choreography of stability, mobility, and movement together. And if you don't train for power, you lose that choreography of tying together this. Because so if I reach out, if you just take your arm and reach out in front of you, everything is going on. You're stabilizing your core to hold the weight of your arm. There's a strength component that has to take place. If I add speed to it, now there has to be a muscle contraction that has to take place. But just think about it. If you're trying to dodge an oncoming car, this is when most people that are older get hurt. They have to do something rapidly. They go skiing for the first time and they're good on the intermediate runs, and all of a sudden they get caught into a position where they have to respond to something that's coming at them fast, and their body just has to take over. The mind can't work that fast. They can't think through it. And so the body then has to have that choreography of muscles. And it's called proprioception. That's the technical term. If you go to physical therapy, the first thing they try to do is get the muscles to fire back, and proprioception. So it's that choreography of muscles working in tandem. Power solves that. So you feel better. I call it, my best litmus test for myself is the old man get up. You ever seen an old man get out of a chair? He puts his hands on his knees. He leans forward because he's trying to unweight his hips. He pushes down with his arms. Usually he grunts, and then he comes up out of the chair. Every one of my older clients, the first thing they tell me is, oh my God, I can get out of the car so much easier.
Yeah.
Just rotating their feet around to the street and pushing themselves out of a car is not difficult anymore. Although they look great before because they were doing the weightlifting, now they can move with power because that's what power is all about. It's movement and combining strength, stability, high-speed contraction, all of these things that your body does naturally, but now you're training for it, and it makes life so much better. I tell people, I go, you can do so much more when you add this power to the component. And we start losing it rapidly, really rapidly. And that's why people fall, because they can't produce the power.